The war had ended 1,000 years ago, yet somehow humanity still carried its scars among the stars. In the red hush before dawn on Caldera 6, wind combed dust across a derelict training ground where broken drones lay like shed skins. The air tasted of iron and memory. In that stillness, a human woman walked, armor quiet, breath steady, 5 small figures pacing in perfect lockstep behind her, cubs, each with eyes like bright, living embers. She said, "Stay close," and they did. Commander Alia Vance moved like an old storm that had learned patience. Her armor bore scorch marks that had become part of her shape. At her hip, a sidearm. On her back, a folded micro-shield like a black petal, and flanking her heels, the cubs, a quintet of rescued Varax kits, tiger-bodied with auric stripes under a dust-gray sheen. They wore harnesses stitched from field webbing and cut-down plating from a crashed dropship. In each chest, a faint glow pulsed with their micro-reactive hearts. They had been born in a lab on a world that no longer existed. They had learned to speak by listening. They had learned to march by watching her feet. At the far end of the grounds, a cyclone fence rattled in the wind. Beyond that fence, the basalt flats ran to the horizon, broken only by the skeletal towers of the decommissioned starport. The city had been evacuated 2 nights ago. Any souls still on Caldera 6 either had reasons or regrets. Alia had one reason that outweighed them all: the cubs. The message had found her in the ash hours, an encoded whisper from an old comrade, the kind of friend whose voice carried the texture of long campaigns. The slaver-fractals were coming. Not the old human slavers, but the new mercenary arm of the Spiral Combine. Synthetic warbands that mapped biosignatures from orbit and harvested rare genomes like ore. They had no hatred in their programming, only a hunger that always finished its work. They would be here by sunset. Alia had stepped into her armor, sealed the soft collar as the cubs watched with unblinking interest. Her left gauntlet flickered, maps scaling down to the lines of the ground she knew. The starport was 15 kilometers. The emergency beacon, a stub tower jammed into a volcanic knuckle, sat halfway there. If she could reach it and trigger the old distress macro, a patrol cutter might catch it. If the cubs had names chosen on a day when the storms were yellow and the food had tasted faintly of plastic. Kai, Rook, Ibis, Lumen, Sedge, they knew their names and answered to her voice. "Stay close," she said again, softer. The sun lifted itself, slate and exhausted. They moved in a diamond, 2 ahead, 2 flanking, 1 at her heel. It was a formation they had invented together during quiet hours when the world pretended to be kind. They didn't speak because words loosened fear. The ground handled sound like a lover, generous with echoes. The cubs adjusted their pads to avoid clatter, learning from the human whose footfalls were famously quiet. On the far horizon, a scar of smoke tried to become a column. Slaver-fractals, maybe, or a misplaced industrial fire. It didn't matter. Everything in the morning meant the same thing. Time was thinner than it looked. They cleared the fence. The cubs wriggled under. Alia vaulted, landing soft, the shock dampeners whispering. She calibrated her HUD, drank a mouthful of stale water. This was not a grand war. There would be no monument, just a road and 5 small lives that had asked her to be the kind of person she still wanted to believe she was. They hit the flats. From orbit, Caldera 6 looked like a bruise on black skin, purples, browns, a scatter of thermal freckles. On the ground, it was all angles and size. Dust devils chased their own tails. The wind tried to tell stories and failed. Alia kept the pace steady, something even the smallest cub could maintain for hours. Kai, the serious one, ranged to the front and angled his ears to map the wind. Rook, all nervous energy, checked every shadow twice. Ibis moved like something learning to fly. Lumen flicked her tail to mark rhythm. Sedge kept glancing up at Alia's face, measuring her calm and borrowing it. At kilometer 2, they passed an old training drone broken open like a beetle. The cubs paused a half step. Alia signaled, and they flowed around without breaking formation. At 4 kilometers, the basalt changed texture, acquiring a shine that meant glassy pockets, old lava frozen mid-scream. Alia marked a safer route and moved them like a river around a stone. At 6 kilometers, the sky made a sound like torn silk. She didn't look up. If it was just wind, it didn't matter. If it was not, there was nothing her eyes could do that her instincts hadn't already begun. The cubs felt it too. Their glow throats quickened. Stay close. A shadow crossed them, not the blunt disc of a shuttle, not the needle of a cutter. This was a stuttering geometry, a swarm cut into menacing pieces, slaver-fractals hunting in formation. They were not alive and yet never stopped acting like predators. They moved as if they had learned fear from a mirror. Alia had fought their kind during the ring wars around Xanthistria. She had watched them reduce entire forests to paper and ash. She had learned 3 truths. They were relentless, they were expensive, and they hated surprises. She aimed to be their ruin in all 3 ways. They slid into a shallow gully and went still. The swarm passed overhead, casting ragged latticework shadows that crawled across the ground. Lumen suppressed a shiver. Kai leaned forward, eyes narrowed. The fractals hesitated, their pattern wavered, and then they moved on, pulled by a richer biosignature, a herd of plains grazers miles to the south. Alia counted to 30. The wind made a sound like someone explaining something too late. They moved again. By the time they reached the stub tower, the sun had edged higher. The tower had been installed during the evacuation, then forgotten. It looked like a rusted finger pointing at nothing. Alia opened the service panel and found a familiar ecosystem of neglect. Dust-matted wires, a cracked capacitor, an interface that spoke 8 languages badly. She could work with it. Her gauntlet spooled a thin cable whispering to the port. She set the macro, an ancient Navy distress chant that tried 100 bands at once, repeating a message carved out of code and stubbornness. If any human ear was listening in this sector, it would hear. She set it to loop, sealed the panel, and took a breath that felt like coming back from somewhere. Food, she said. They ate sparingly under the stub tower's small shade, sucking moisture from the nutrient film while the wind smiled at their attempts to be comfortable. The cubs chewed and watched the horizon. Sedge nudged a piece toward Alia, a ritual gift. Alia pretended to consider, then took it with thanks. The exchange was old between them. It told the cubs they were not burdens. It told Alia she was still human. A voice came down the wind, tinny by accident. Not the distress channel, something local, static cracked like brittle fabric. Ahead of schedule ground pickup coordinates. Alia froze, the cubs with her. She eased the receiver volume up with her thumb. The voice returned, sandpaper over iron. You'll see our signal flare, keep the pens intact, high-value specimens only. As if her fear had been summoned into shape, 3 figures rose on the horizon, specks resolving into men as they walked toward the tower. Their stride had the confidence of those defended by a shadow they trusted. Slaver ground scouts, 1 with a sampler on his back, 2 with rifles cut for desert. Alia considered the math. She could avoid them skirting wide. But her signal tower was broadcasting on 100 bands. A curious scan would find it, and then they would wait here, a beacon for those who wanted to peel the edges off the future and sell what leaked out. If she made a statement, she needed it to be simple. This place is closed. Stay close, she said and stood. The cubs aligned like a sentence ending with a sharp period. The men saw her and grinned in the way that assumes the next minute belongs to you. They lifted their rifles in a lazy threat, covering distance with boots that believed the ground loved them. When they were near enough to scent her breath, the tallest one touched the brim of an invisible hat and said the kind of thing scavengers always say. Nice pets. Alia didn't answer. She pivoted so gently it almost wasn't a movement, and the cubs, God bless how quick they were, flowed at her heel to keep the shape. The men saw it then, something animal that was not pet. Their grins were taken by the wind. Hey now, the tall one said, recalibrating to menace. We'll be, Alia fired. One shot, a stitch of light that kissed his rifle apart. She didn't shoot the man. She knew what children looked like who had watched a parent die for nothing. Instead, she stepped close enough that her voice could be one more thing buzzing in his panicked vein. Leave. The last word hit like a soft hammer. The men saw something in her eyes that had nothing to do with heroism and everything to do with endurances they couldn't pronounce. They backed away, used to the arithmetic of risk. She didn't move. Behind her, the cubs held position, still as gods. The men became small, then they were horizon again, then they were gone. Alia waited a long breath and then longer. A hawk, mechanical, cheap, its belly shining with cameras, etched a line across the sky but did not turn. She listened to the tower's thrumming pulse. The cubs eased. Rook looked up with a face full of questions he didn't have words for yet. She stroked his ear with one armored finger and felt within her the tiny leash of relief pull taut and then snap. They moved on. The city began as suggestion before becoming a place. The long, low blocks of the decommissioned starport shouldered the wind. Advert boards stood dead-eyed, still trying to sell the past. The concourses were empty, the shops a collection of ghosts. In an alley, a forgotten service droid hummed to itself and then fell quiet, like a man rehearsing a speech to an empty room. Alia brought the cubs into shadow. The starport's control tower bore scorch marks in a vertical hymn. She had trained in a tower like that when she was young and less careful with her luck. The cubs sniffed the air. Kai's throat glow quickened, Ibis crouched, and Lumen's tail stilled. That was their language for something wrong. The Combine had arrived. They had come quiet, black craft knifing down to the port, their landing struts sinking into a dust that remembered everything. They had painted over their logos a dozen times. You could still see the ghosts of old names under the matte finish. They had loaded pens, flexible fences built on the science of despair into the concourse. Now they were out in the open field, constructing a cage from modular segments. It looked like a playground that hated joy. Alia counted, 2 squads visible, a heavy unit near the ship, officers with that glossy, fish-eyed calm. But the important thing was the scanner tower they'd unfolded like origami and raised against the sky. It was mapping everything with impersonal appetite. In its flashes, Alia saw all the children still on this world. She saw them cataloged down to their melanin and milk teeth. She had to cut that tower. She whispered, "Stay close," and the phrase had begun to mean more than its words. They used the maintenance tunnels, those narrow veins that carried electricity and comfort beneath spaces built for spectacle. The cubs became shadows with weight. Alia became a memory of herself. She counted doors and grates. She marked the cadence of boots overhead. The tunnels smelled like hot dust and regret. As service hatch below the scanner tower, she pried up the grill and peered. The tower's base sat on a lattice of carbon struts. An access panel blinked politely, waiting for someone with a title. She had never been patient with titles. She sent Kai and Lumen to the perimeter around an overturned cart, Rook and Ibis to a culvert shadow. Sedge stayed with her steady. She breathed once to measure the size of the air and then moved. It was not graceful. Grace was for days when the stakes were balanced. This was blunt and sure. She reached the panel and sank a line into its throat. It tried to mutter at her in combined tea-room language. She spoke back in military. It tried to protest. She popped its jaw and jammed a wedge, then told it what to believe. The cubs were still. Above her, the tower wavered, uncertain for the first time since it had become taller than a thought. A shout. She didn't look. Sedge growled, low and human in its meaning. She cut the tower and let it fall. It made a sound like rain finding a new roof. Then the world filled with noise. The combined squads bloomed into motion, men and machines and their machines. Alia threw the micro-shield and it grew into a wall of almost hard light, a yawn frozen into shape. Shots rippled the air. The micro-shield hummed, sang, complained. The cubs in the culvert waited for the gap that would be the only one they got. Alia didn't give ground. She stepped, 1-2, fired, 1-2, then stepped again. She didn't shoot to kill. She shot to warn, to disrupt, to make them kneel to questions they didn't want to answer. A shot kissed the micro-shield's edge and a shimmer ran across its skin like cold water. "Now," she said, and the word unlocked the cubs. Rook and Ibis poured from shadow and became speed. They didn't aim for flesh. They took belts and rifles, helmets and scopes. They made the combined soldiers scramble, bending their rhythm out of tune. Kai and Lumen harried the flank, splitting attention like a trick of light. Sedge stepped at her side and bared teeth that were a weapon not because of their sharpness, but because of what they meant. Alia moved through men who were too used to winning. She asked nothing and gave only one thing, a choice. Leave or stay and learn something that would not make a good story later. Several took the lesson the easy way. She reached the gate release for the pens and flipped it. The flexible fences shuddered open. Inside, a collection of captives blinked at light as if it were green for the first time. They were not all human and not all grown. A tall woman with dust in her hair recognized something in Alia's posture and didn't ask questions. She gathered a clutch of Lekka children with eyes like dew and ran. The combined officers saw control slipping and sent the heavy unit. It rolled like a decision down a bank. Alia had seen its kind. It began to unfurl, disassembling into an arrangement of cruel shapes that could chew through almost anything that wanted to keep its shape. She grabbed Sedge and threw him back toward cover. Then she stepped into the open and fired at the heavy's eyes. It blinked. Lumen darted, took the stanchion of a support arm and danced away like a thought a man pretends he didn't have. The heavy spat bright language. Rook leaped, small and brave beyond measure, and left a ragged bloom of sparks as he removed a sensor cluster with his teeth. Kai found a seam and drove a harness blade in. The heavy staggered, a word you don't give to machines lightly, but it fit. Alia drove a shaped charge into the slit that was its breath. The heavy became quiet all at once, like a liar granted truth. They ran. The starport had become a field of small wars, each one a coin tossed to the same old question: how much does a life owe its future? People ran with bundles in their arms, with a child's hand in their own, with guilt trailing them like a scarf. The cubs flowed through it all as if they had been born from this panic and had learned to be gentler than it was. They reached a maintenance lift leading up to the control tower. She had to see what the sky was doing. They piled in, the lift complained and then rose. The city moved below them like a map you were almost old enough to understand. In the tower, the consoles were dead or sullen. She coaxed one into life and watched the sky. The distress macro was singing a song in every language. The combined ships had drowned it out with their own quiet, but now there, a thin reply like the note left after a glass sings. A cutter, small, human, off its patrol route and curious. Alia closed her eyes. "Stay with me," the reply clarified. Vector approach, 10 minutes. The combined ships oriented, sniffing at the new smell in the air. They did not fear a cutter, that was their mistake. Humans don't send ships to win, we send them to ask questions faster. "Hold," she told the cubs, though she wanted to run and reach the landing field and throw her voice across the sky. The combined threw up a comm screen that lied about jurisdiction. The cutter ignored it with an old Navy sneer. It cut low along the horizon, waking dust. Against the control tower glass, Alia watched her own reflection become a stranger and then herself again. "Signal them," she said to the console, and it did, sending a vector and a truth. "Civilians, armed enemy, extraction imperative." The cutter answered with the voice of a woman who'd long ago forgotten how to be afraid. "On final, keep your heads down, folks." The combined turned guns skyward. The cutter jinked, laughed, and dropped flares like saints hurling petals. "Down," Alia said. Now, they plunged back into the lift. It groaned in protest. Halfway down it stopped, declared a strike, and refused to continue. She popped the panel, kicked the manual release, and they descended the last floors on a cable that smelled like burned coins. The Cubs landed first, light. Alia second, heavy. They ran for the main field. The cutter broke into view like hope learning to breathe. It was an old model, big in the belly, with scorch marks like freckles. Its ramp yawned while its thrusters shoved air around like impatience. The Combine had deployed portable interdiction plates, trying to create a gravity that only loved them. The cutter ignored the plates and bullied physics into doing what it wanted. People were running at it from every direction. A boy with a string of beads held above his head like a flag. A woman with a jar of something that had been important to her mother. A man who had the look of someone who had never planned to run and was now very good at it. Alia saw all of that in a heartbeat. She also saw the combined squads vectoring to cut off the flow. "Rook," she said, "Ibis, left flank." They went without pause. Kai, Lumen, right. They became angles worried by wind. Sedge, on me. They were a formation now, not the mimic of one. They were a sentence with an intention. At the halfway mark, a net launcher rose on stilts and tried to write an end to the story. Sedge met it with a jump that made a lie of gravity. His harness blade whispered through the net limb and the launcher sagged, suddenly old. Alia met a combined soldier who looked too young to be bored. He lifted his rifle as if it were his first and only friend. She caught it on her forearm guard and turned it. "Go home," she said. He looked at her and believed. He ran. The cutter's ramp boomed as feet hit it. The ship's crew, faces hard with trust, hauled people in with a kindness that looked like violence. The cutter's belly swallowed the evacuees and demanded more. Alia paused, looked right. Kai and Lumen had redirected a squad into chasing nothing. Left. Rook had removed a gun hand from a desire to pull a trigger. Ibis pulled at a belt that held grenades and made them fall into a fountain they had no business visiting. Sedge. She didn't have the words to say what she wanted to say and didn't have time to invent them. He looked at her and knew. They reached the ramp as the cutter's pilot shouted something about weight and fuel and tomorrow's news. Alia waved evacuees past her with movements that had become the world to her. Someone tugged at her sleeve, an old man whose hand shook with the memory of thunder. She steadied him onto the ramp and felt the season turn behind her. The Combine had brought new toys. A drone swarm rose like a hiss you could see. Not big, not clever, but many. They moved like a thought that had failed to become an idea, and each one carried a sting that could write an end to a person's day. She turned to face them. The Cubs pressed close, waiting for the word. Alia's heart did something human and clumsy in her chest. "Stay close," she said. "Then go when I go." The drone swarm met the cutter's countermeasures in midair and argued. Sparks fell like strange snow. Some drones broke through, mean little bullets with their own opinions. Alia shot, a beat that found an old rhythm in her bones. The Cubs leaped, jaws and harness blades finding the places where the drone's logic ran thin. They broke the swarm's courage. And courage is a thing, yes, even machines have it, that leaks when you poke it just so. The last evacuees reached the ramp. Alia shoved them up with words that had long ago learned to be hands. The pilot called out another number that felt like limits pretending to be rules. "Commander," a voice said in her ear. The cutter had linked her channel. "You and your unit now, we're burning." She looked at the Cubs. They looked back. They ran the ramp, small bodies moving with a soldier's grace. Inside, a crewman who had met all kinds of beautiful strangeness dropped to a knee and held out hands wide enough for trust. The Cubs accepted. Kai went first, the serious one. Lumen threw a glance back, tail high. Rook skidded, laughing in the way kittens laugh when the stakes are low, then remembered the stakes and sobered. Sedge lingered. He looked at Alia, then at the field where the Combine were almost done with their arguing and ready to try the simple answer of more force. His face, with its stripes and glow, had somehow learned to be a picture of a question. "Go," she said. He went. Alia stepped onto the ramp, felt it tremble with her. She was 3 strides up when the shot came, a neat little coin of light that decided to visit her ribs. It found armor that had the decency to be brave but not the good fortune to be a miracle. She staggered. The world tilted, the ramp became a cliff, the sky embraced her with a tired blue arm. The cubs made a sound that evenly split the difference between animal and him. Hands caught her. The crew hauled her into the belly as the pilot's voice said a word that in any language means, "Now." The ramp rose, gravity changed its mind, and the cutter left the field in a rage of dust and physics. The Combine fired after them, but hate always trails love by a step. Inside the cutter, Alia's vision narrowed to a keyhole. She had known worse pain, she had known different. She found the shape of Sedge's head under her hand and fixed it there. The medic crouched over her with a bag full of promises. The cubs pressed against her armor plates in a ring that looked like a small, brave planet. "You'll be fine," the medic said, with a lie so practiced it came out like prayer. She smiled despite the pain. "Get them water," she said. The words were heavy and ran like tar. The medic moved fast. The cubs lapped from cups, their tongues small engines of survival. Kai kept one eye on Alia and one on the door, already a soldier. Rook's ears flattened in a grief he didn't understand. Ibis tucked herself under Alia's arm as if trying to help hold her together. Lumen watched the medic's hands to learn the craft. Sedge rested his head on Alia's thigh and listened to the rhythm of the armor's whispers. The cutter climbed into a sky that gradually forgot the ground. The city fell away, then the island of the starport, then the curve of the world. The pilot's voice softened. "We're clear." Alia shut her eyes because the stars were too much like eyes. Sleep came, not gentle, but the kind that pulls you into a dark room and shuts the door slowly. The cubs shifted until their bodies made a blanket that lay heavy and warm across her legs. In the hum of the cutter, she dreamed of a child's hand in hers and sand that kept its promises. The medic saved her. That is a simple sentence hiding many smaller sentences. The needle bit. The field bandage tightened. The blood accepted its new path. The armor opened like a friend and then closed like a fortress. They moved her to the med bay, 2 beds, a cupboard, a story about a ship that saved people for a living, and the cubs followed. The crew tried to set rules and then learned the rules were already here and made of 5 small shapes with glowing throats. In the long drift to the rendezvous with a bigger ship, the cubs learned the corridors. They learned that some doors opened with a paw on the plate, others required the right look and the right tone. They learned the medic's name and the pilot's and the engineer who swore in a dialect that made profanity sound like poetry. The crew learned how to step without tripping over hope. At shift change, Alia woke. The cubs rushed her with such precise gentleness that it made the medic cry and pretend not to. She held them against her, 5 small weights that were somehow heavier than the ship. When she spoke, her voice had sand in it. "Stay close." They settled, tails curled, breath sinking in a chorus that sounded like forgiveness. In the days that followed, the cutter did what cutters do. It ferried the living to a place where they could try again. The combined ships made noises in space and then lost interest, as mercenaries do when the numbers stop adding. The distress macro reached other ears. Larger ships came, full of uniforms and opinions. The refugees were distributed like seeds across the soil of human space. The cubs watched it all and made choices. Kai insisted on learning the ship's maps. The pilot laughed and showed him, and he spent hours staring at star charts as if they were personal letters. Rook taught himself how to open the ration locker and then how to close it without anyone hearing. Ibis found the observation port and sat there, paws on the glass, watching dust float through light. Lumen learned the med kit by heart and fetched tools before the medic asked. Sedge did nothing that could be described and yet held everything together with the quietness of his presence. Alia healed. Healing is another simple word that hides a war. She slept under lights that hummed. She woke to the ship singing to itself in clicks and sighs. She walked the length of the cutter with a hand on the wall to steady herself, and the cubs matched their pace to hers without discussion. She did not think about how close she had come to being a story that others told to make themselves kinder. She did not think about the way the combined officer's face had looked when his machine fell. She thought about water. She thought about seeds. She thought about how much of her life had been taken up by leaving places, and how she had used that to justify staying in none. They dropped into harbor at Helios Station, where ships came to exhale. The station was a wheel and a city and a rumor. Refugees were given docks like temporary citizenship. Volunteers met the cutter, tired people with clipboards, a species older than space. The cubs pressed close at the edge of the ramp like stones that had learned to be animals. Alia stood upright and let the wind of 1,000 conversations move through her. "Commander Vance," someone said, as if they were trying the shape of the name to see if it tasted like the person. We've got a situation in Sector 10. Of course they did. The galaxy is very large, but situations always find the people who think they have finished with them. Not today, someone else said. That someone had an old gym injury and a voice like gravel poured into a bucket. He looked at Alia with the rare directness of a person who has loved their own life and knew its price. "You're in no condition." She smiled. It felt like remembering something pleasant and secret. "I'm a passenger," she said, "today." The cubs looked at her. She nodded and they eased, but only by degrees. There is a kind of relaxation someone learns that is really just a readiness wearing a silk shirt. They were given quarters, a room with 4 bunks and a window that showed a piece of space that had decided to pretend to be calm. The cubs took the bunks like kings who remember they had been peasants. Alia sat on the edge of the lowest one and unlaced herself from the day. The door chimed. She almost said stay close, but they were already by her ankles, lined up in that diamond, small and fierce. The door opened to reveal a child with hair like a promise. She held something cupped in her hands. "For the kittens," she said, solemn as weather. She showed the cup, 5 slices of dried fruit arranged as if arranging them had been an act of worship. Alia accepted the cup as if it were a medal. "What's your name?" "Lyro." The child's eyes were old and new at once. "I was in the pen," she added as if it were a fact like height or favorite color. Alia nodded. "Me too," she said. They shared the fruit. The cubs ate around the child's hands with the care of surgeons. Lyro's mouth softened, and for a moment the scars of her day laid down their tools and went to sleep. Then she left because children are better at leaving than anyone. The station became a map of tasks, small things that needed steady hands. Alia and the cubs were very good at being steady. They fixed a broken water main. They sat with a man who had lost his brother and in a language older than language, reminded him that his lungs knew what to do. They argued in quiet ways with the bureaucrat who wanted to send the refugees back along the routes that had broken them. Helios Station gathered itself like a flock. A week became 2. The scar in Alia's ribs healed into something that complained when it rained, which was often in a station where rain was a choice. Then the combine returned, not as a wave, not as a wrecking ball, as a precise, moral little expedition with papers and a certified jurisdiction that claimed the right to collect biological property rescued off-contract from combined operations. They came with smiles like cup rims. They came with offer drafts and polite words whose meanings had rusted into crimes. They came with 3 ships parked just outside the station's weapon range. Not a threat, a suggestion. They wanted the cubs. They wanted them because a genome that glows is a portfolio you can carry in a cage and park in a lab and sell as salvation to the right customer. They wanted the Cubs because they wanted to prove that people like the Combine always win eventually. The station council convened. It was a room built for arguments with a table that had dent marks from the last time beliefs had fought. Alia stood with the Cubs beside her. The Combine representative spoke first. They used the word assets with reverence. They used the phrase legal compliance with all the compassion of a locked door. They made sounds about safety. They suggested the station's well-being depended on being reasonable. Alia said nothing. She had learned long ago that speaking too early is like giving away your second breath. The council asked if the Cubs were dangerous. She said yes and no, and that's not the point. She described a field and a tower and a ramp and a choice. She did not make speeches about humanity. She did not need to because the word hung in the air like a scent. The Combined man with eyes like peeled grapes smiled. "Commander Vance," he said, turning the title into a plaything. "You're well known for your passion, but we can't be swayed by nostalgia." He gestured toward the Cubs. "These are animals of value. They belong to a party with legally binding." Kai stepped forward and put a paw on the table. He looked at the Combined man with a calm that had been borrowed from Alia and made into a shape of its own. "We belong to ourselves," he said. It was the first time he had spoken in a room this full. His voice was clear. His grammar only bent minor rules that deserved bending. The other Cubs flickered their throats in agreement, and the room, composed of people who had never in their lives seen a small tiger address a quorum, forgot how to breathe for a full second. Alia's face did not change. Inside, something old and quiet stood up and stretched. The council asked questions, softer now. Lumen answered one about memory and fear. Rook answered one about hunting without hate. Ibis spoke about the observation port and the way dust looked in light. Sedge said nothing, and in doing so said the thing that needed saying. The Combined man smiled again because some smiles are independent of the weather. He said words like sentience audit and custody hearing, as if they were not knives he kept wrapped in velvet. He suggested an off-site evaluation by Combined specialists. He suggested law. He suggested kindness that wore a suit of armor. Helio Station breathed out. It had complicated policies. It had to, but it also had a memory. On the wall behind the council table, a motto was carved in steel from an old ship's hull. "We keep what comes to us safe until it can keep itself." A vote was called. Voices rose. The Combined raised an eyebrow like a weapon. The station chose the Cubs. Rules were written in chalk next to the permanent letters. Guardianship. Non-export without consent. A committee that would not be bureaucrats as much as they would be neighbors. The Combined representatives smiled and left to call their friends. And then the Combined ships outside moved a little closer. Helio Station was built to be a harbor, not a fortress. Its guns were ceremonial compared to the tools of specialized war, but harbor cities have teeth. The station rotated a degree, presenting its thickest plates. Boarding teams woke from their hammocks. The cutter crews checked their loads. The medics took inventory and smiled in ways that made prayer unnecessary. Alia walked to the Cubs' quarters. They were waiting in formation. She did not ask if they were ready. She did not say she was sorry that the world keeps asking babies to become soldiers before they have learned all their games. She just touched each head in turn, feeling the vibration of those little hearts. "We keep close," she said. They went to the docks. The Combined came, not as conquering heroes, not as faceless horrors, as people who believed their paychecks wrote the world. Their boarding craft made lines in the black like handwriting that could be read from above. They came with non-lethals that could become lethals, and with attitudes that jumped back and forth between bored and anxious. Helio Station answered with speed, and with something the Combined had not inventoried: community. The pilots flew cutters like ideas you can't quite have. The dockworkers made barricades out of crates and stubbornness. The cooks fed people. The engineers lied to the power grid until it told the truth the station needed. The Cubs moved with Alia through it all, a small orbit around a quiet star. At Dock 7, a combined boarding team cut the door with a polite circle. They stepped through as if entering a quiet church. The Cubs were waiting in the pooling shadow of the bulkhead. The boarding team saw 5 small animals and 1 human woman and relaxed too early. Alia threw a paint grenade. It burst across armor and masks, occluding sensors with bright human defiance. The Cubs darted, pulled belts, cut lines, took weapons, and handed them to gravity. Zijin, the team leader, a woman who would later decide to change jobs, found her gun pointing at the floor and wondered how it had gotten there. "Leave," Alia said, in the same voice she had used on the salt flats. The word was a hinge. Things turned on it. They left. Not all of them. Some had to be carried by their friends because their legs had forgotten their business. Alia did not hunt them. She had learned through years and blood that you don't create more orphans than the galaxy already manufactures for free. Across the station, similar stories were being written, small, precise victories that added up to a message. The Combine realized, slowly and then all at once, that Helios was not an easy mark. Their ships floated at the edge of weapon range and leafed through their playbook, only to discover someone had spilled coffee on the page they needed. A hail came in from the outside. Not the Combine, not Navy. A caravan of independent haulers, humans with ships that smelled like oil and old jokes, had heard the distress Macro's cousin and decided to add their weight. They emerged from dark like uncles arriving at a fight the family hadn't expected them to care about. Helios Station didn't cheer. It didn't have time. It simply opened berths, redistributed loads, and made a new plan that old hands recognized by taste. Alia and the Cubs took their place in it. They became runners of messages and breakers of momentum. They sealed doors and opened others. They showed newcomers which corridors had stray gravity like bad tempers and which had steady floors. Kai mapped, Rook fetched, Ibis watched, Lumen learned, Sedge steadied. Alia moved among them, the center they had chosen, the gravity that loved them. In a quiet stretch between alarms, she found herself in the observation port where Ibis liked to sit. The stars were a mess of points and lines, the kind of geometry that feels like a prophecy. Beside her, Sedge pressed his head against her knee, a weight that said present here now. "Stay close," she said without turning her head. He did. The Combine backed off. They were not a crusade, they were a business. They logged their losses and calibrated the cost of anger, and anger lost. They took their ships and left Helios a gift it hadn't expected to earn, time. The station exhaled the way people do after a laugh that turned into a sob. Repairs began. The council wrote the temporary policy into more enduring law. The Cubs became citizens in the way some places define citizenship, as a promise made both ways. The galaxy, being what it is, did not clap. It simply took this into the long account that all worlds maintain in ledgers with margins full of doodles and tears. But word travels in space like coffee smell in a crowded kitchen. Stories grew. Some were wrong in ways stories are always wrong. Some were right enough to make the wrong easy to forgive. A woman in armor, 5 small tigers, a station that remembered its motto out loud. Alia and the Cubs found a new rhythm. They were offered a place on a long-haul ship, a slow arc that would build gardens in transit. They were offered training posts in the station's security and consultation paths for those who wanted to learn the art of gentle victory. They were offered quiet, and for a moment, Alia almost reached out both hands, but the distress macros never stopped singing. The galaxy is very big, and it is full of children who have not yet learned to choose their names. They set out again, not running, moving. Not fugitives, sentences leaving a paragraph to go find the next. Helios Station saw them off with the kind of ceremony it reserves for people who have become part of its memory. Lyro stood on tiptoe to kiss each cub on the forehead and whispered a secret into Sedge's ear. He never repeated it, but sometimes at night, he made a small sound like a hush that had turned into a smile. They traveled for a year that felt like two. They rescued a research team from a planet that tried to eat them with kindness. They argued a pirate captain into becoming a courier. They taught a mining colony how to filter arsenic out of smiles. They learned to sleep wherever a room chose to be. They learned that sometimes victory looks like a door closed slowly and a light left on in the kitchen. The cubs grew, not big. Big is a word for statues and mistakes. They became themselves, full-size versions of beginnings that had once fit in Alia's hands. Their eyes remained bright. Their throats still glowed, now in colors that shifted with feeling. Kai became a navigator with a talent for maps that had not yet been drawn. Rook made friends with engineers and collected tools as if they were punchlines. Ibis wrote a catalog of stars seen from places no one had previously stood still enough to notice. Lumen learned medicine beyond first aid, and the word she said most often was breathe. Sedge learned to be quiet in more languages than most people learn to speak. Alia grew in a different way. The scar in her ribs taught her the weather even in ships. Her hair kept its streak of iron. Her voice learned to be softer without losing edges. She started to dream, sometimes, of a house on a planet that loved her, with a yard where 5 marks in the dirt meant something like home. It happened in a place called the Orrery, a star cluster so precise it felt artificial. A combined research ship off its route had strayed too close to a station of orphans that had become a community by mistake. The research ship saw the community as a problem to be solved. The community saw the ship as a story they didn't want to hear. The distress macro reached Alia and the cubs like a bell. They arrived to find the Combine attempting to move people into pens built from academic justifications. The station, made of welded modules and hope, thrummed with stubbornness. The Combine had done their homework, they had the papers. The station had done a different homework, it had a memory. Alia did not give a speech. She positioned. She sent the cubs where they were needed before even she knew the need, trusting the practiced dance that had become their way of saying we. When the Combine officer, young, clever, with a haircut like certainty, confronted her, he started with accusations. She let him. He offered a choice written in small print. She lit it on fire with a look. "This is not war," he said when she suggested he leave. "This is administration." "Those two things," she said, "are often the same." He gestured at her. "You're just one person." She looked at the cubs, then at the station, and then at the long sweep of space beyond. She thought of a stub tower and a ramp and a word that was a hinge. She thought of all the people who had once been one person and had decided to multiply by daring. "I'm 5, she said, "and 5 is enough." The Combine officer made the mistake of laughing. The station saw him do it and hardened. In the too quiet that followed, every person present chose a future. The choices edged toward the same direction. The fight was brief. It was a negotiation conducted with the language of bodies and ships rather than syllables. The result was an answer everyone already knew but had been pretending was complicated. The Combine left, and the station wrote the names of the day's helpers in chalk on a wall that had never needed erasing. Alia and the cubs didn't stay for applause. They didn't leave to avoid it. They left because there is always the next place where a sentence needs writing. They became, in time, one of those stories that travel well. Travelers told their names at fires that hadn't seen them. A boy on a vine station made wooden figures that looked like a woman in armor and 5 animals with glowing throats. A girl on a cold world used their story to remind herself that nobody owns the future. Bureaucrats learned to hesitate before signing the papers that justify the nets. Even the Combine changed a little. A small unit defected. A captain retired early with a conscience he had recovered in a thrift shop. Years later, on a world whose sunsets were a better artist than its dawns, Alia and the cubs found the house that had been waiting for them. It was not grand. It had a porch and a kitchen, and the yard accepted paw prints as part of its design. The cubs made paths that the grass memorized. Alia planted a tree and named it for a person she was not anymore. They did not stop moving. They could have, but then who would write the next sentence? The house became a base, not a stop. They went and returned and went again, teaching a neighborhood to wave at stars as if they were neighbors. Sedge grew wise in the visible way some people do, where the set of their body translates to patience. Kai's maps became an atlas scholars treated as something between science and poetry. Rook started a workshop and built devices whose purpose was kindness disguised as mischief. Ibis took children to the observation hill and taught them how to name lights without owning them. Lumen opened a small clinic with a sign that said, in a dozen tongues, breathing happens here. Alia woke each morning and found them at her feet, eyes bright, bodies ready. She would say the same words, ritual now worn comfortable by years. Stay close. They did. And then they went where she pointed, because closeness isn't about distance and leading isn't about being first. When the combine finally learned, truly learned, not just filed away in a memo, that taking isn't the same as having, it was not because a Navy fleet bombarded them into humility, not because an empire passed a law. It was because 5 small lives had modeled a world where possession was replaced by protection, and where power listened to the voices at ankle height. It was because 1,000 stations passed around a small motto until it felt like a heartbeat. We keep what comes to us safe until it can keep itself. On the last day of the long year, when the story was finally larger than the letters that had started it, Alia stood on the porch of the house and watched the cubs return from an errand that had saved someone she would never meet. The sun hung like a coin that had decided to sit rather than roll. The cubs came up the path in formation without thinking, and she felt the old thrill of seeing the world assemble itself around a purpose. She said nothing at first. She watched them drink from the bowl on the step. She watched the way they checked the shadows as if shadows were old friends who sometimes forgot themselves. She watched the way the neighborhood kids had learned to step around them without fear, and the way the old woman across the way waved with a hand that once shook but didn't anymore. She said, finally, because words only matter when they mean less than their silence, "Good work." They looked at her as if the phrase were an embrace. They settled at her feet as always, forming the shape that had become the galaxy's favorite story. Night came, stars sprawled. Somewhere far away a distress macro began to sing. They stood as one, and the house understood and stayed behind to wait for their return. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken. Headphone, if you're enjoying this story, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars.